The guns fell silent across Europe on May 8, 1945. Millions celebrated in the streets, soldiers embraced their families, and the world believed the nightmare was finally over. But in the rubble of Berlin, in the bombed-out cities of Germany, in the refugee camps stretching across the continent, another war was already beginning, one that would last 45 years, consume trillions of dollars, bring the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation multiple times, and reshape every aspect of global politics. And the terrifying thing is that this war began not months or years after WWII ended, but literally within hours, because even as Allied and Soviet troops were still celebrating their victory over Nazi Germany, their commanders were already viewing each other not as allies, but as future enemies. And the proof of this is chilling. On May 8, 1945, the same day Germany surrendered, Winston Churchill ordered his military chiefs to begin planning Operation Unthinkable, a proposal to attack the Soviet Union with American and British forces, potentially rearming surrendered German troops to fight alongside the Western Allies against their former Soviet partners. And this wasn't some distant contingency plan. Churchill wanted it ready for implementation by July 1, 1945. Less than 2 months away, because he had come to believe that Stalin's Soviet Union represented a threat equal to or greater than Hitler's Germany had been. That the Red Army occupying Eastern Europe would never leave. That Soviet communism would spread across the continent unless stopped by force. And he was right about the occupation. The Soviets would indeed maintain control over Eastern Europe for the next 45 years. But Operation Unthinkable never happened, because when British military planners actually analyzed the proposal, they concluded it was insane. The Red Army had over 400 divisions in Europe, battle-hardened troops who had just defeated the Wehrmacht, while American and British forces were already demobilizing, soldiers desperate to go home after years of war, and the public in both countries would never support immediately attacking their Soviet allies. So, Operation Unthinkable was shelved, but the thinking behind it wasn't, because Churchill and a growing number of Western leaders had recognized something fundamental, that the alliance with the Soviet Union had been purely tactical, born of necessity against Hitler, and now that Hitler was gone, the fundamental incompatibility between Soviet communism and Western democracy was reasserting itself. And Stalin knew this too. He had never trusted his Western allies, had always believed they would eventually turn on him, and his paranoia was partly justified because Britain and the United States had tried to strangle the Bolshevik Revolution in its cradle back in 1918, sending troops to support the White Russians against the Reds, an intervention the Soviets never forgot. So from Stalin's perspective, maintaining control over Eastern Europe wasn't aggression, it was security, creating a buffer zone of friendly communist states between the Soviet Union and the West. Invasion like the one Germany had just launched, that cost 27 million Soviet lives. But from the Western perspective, this looked like imperial expansion, the replacement of Nazi tyranny with Soviet tyranny, and the question became, where would it stop? Would Stalin be satisfied with Eastern Europe, or would he push into Western Europe, into Greece, into Turkey, into the Middle East? And in the immediate aftermath of WWII, nobody knew the answer, which created a period of intense uncertainty and fear, because the world had just witnessed what modern total war looked like, had seen entire cities obliterated, had developed weapons of unimaginable destructive power, and now two superpowers with completely incompatible ideologies and enormous military forces were facing each other across a divided Europe. And the tension escalated rapidly. In 1946, Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, declaring that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind it lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And this wasn't hyperbole, it was accurate description, because the Soviets were systematically consolidating control, rigging elections, eliminating opposition, installing communist governments. And Western Europe was vulnerable. Its economies shattered by 6 years of war, its people exhausted and demoralized. Communist parties gaining strength in France and Italy, and there was genuine fear that Western Europe might fall to communism not through Soviet invasion, but through internal political collapse, which led to one of the most consequential decisions in American history, the Marshall Plan, announced in 1947. $13 billion in American aid to rebuild Western Europe's economy. And this wasn't just humanitarian generosity, it was strategic calculation, the belief that economic prosperity would inoculate Western Europe against communist ideology, that people with jobs and hope wouldn't turn to revolution. And it worked. Western Europe recovered, economies boomed, communist parties lost support. But this also hardened the division of Europe, because Stalin forced Eastern European countries to reject Marshall Plan aid, seeing it as American economic imperialism, an attempt to buy influence. So Europe split into two economic blocs, capitalist West and communist East. And this economic division was reinforced by military division. In 1949, the Western powers formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance explicitly designed to counter Soviet power. And the Soviets responded by creating the Warsaw Pact, their own military alliance of Eastern European states. So now you had two armed camps facing each other, both with massive conventional forces, both increasingly hostile. And then in 1949, something happened that changed everything. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb years earlier than Western intelligence had predicted. And suddenly, the Cold War became a nuclear confrontation, because the American nuclear monopoly that had existed since 1945 was broken, and both superpowers began building enormous nuclear arsenals, bombs that could destroy entire cities in an instant. And this created a completely new form of warfare, or rather a situation where total warfare became suicidal. To war. Both countries would be destroyed, their cities incinerated, tens of millions dead, possibly the end of human civilization. And this gave birth to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the idea that nuclear weapons prevented war precisely because using them guaranteed your own destruction. But this also meant that every crisis, every confrontation, carried the risk of accidental or intentional escalation to nuclear war. And there were many such crises. The first major one was Berlin, the city divided between Soviet and Western sectors, deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. And in 1948, Stalin tried to force the Western powers out by blockading all land access to West Berlin, cutting off food, fuel, everything, expecting the Western sectors to surrender or starve. But instead, the Americans and British launched the Berlin airlift, flying in thousands of tons of supplies every day for nearly a year. And Stalin eventually backed down, but the crisis had brought both sides to the edge of war, and it established a pattern that would repeat throughout the Cold War. Confrontation, escalation, brinkmanship, then backing away from the precipice. And the question was always whether next time someone would miscalculate, whether next time nuclear weapons would actually be used. And this fear intensified in 1950 when war broke out in Korea, a country divided after World War II between Soviet-backed North and American-backed South. And when North Korea invaded the South, the U.S. intervened with UN authorization, and China entered on North Korea's side. And suddenly, you had American and Chinese forces fighting each other, American generals like MacArthur proposing to use nuclear weapons against China. The real possibility of WWII breaking out in Asia. And it didn't happen. Truman fired MacArthur. The war stalemated. An armistice was signed in 1953, leaving Korea divided, pretty much where it started. But the Korean War established that the Cold War wasn't just a European confrontation. It was global, and it would be fought through proxy wars, with the superpowers arming and supporting opposing sides in conflicts around the world. In Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and this pattern dominated the next 4 decades. Direct superpower conflict was too dangerous because of nuclear weapons, so instead they fought each other indirectly. And this created a bizarre situation where WWII was constantly threatened but never happened, because both sides recognized that total war meant mutual annihilation. So instead, there was this permanent state of tension, of crises and confrontations and proxy wars. And the closest the world came to actual nuclear war was probably October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. And President Kennedy demanded their removal, established a naval blockade of Cuba. And for 13 days, the world held its breath as the two superpowers faced off. Soviet ships carrying missiles sailing toward the American blockade, both sides' nuclear forces on highest alert. And there were moments during those 13 days when nuclear war seemed not just possible, but likely. When military officers on both sides were recommending strikes, when submarines carried nuclear torpedoes and had authorization to use them if communications were lost, when a single miscalculation or accident could have triggered the apocalypse. And somehow, miraculously, Kennedy and Khrushchev found a way to back down. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles. The Americans secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey, and the crisis ended. But it had revealed just how close the Cold War could come to turning hot, and it changed how both sides approached the confrontation, leading to things like the hotline between Washington and Moscow, agreements on nuclear testing, recognition that they needed to manage the competition to prevent it from becoming annihilation. But the competition continued, and one of its strangest manifestations was the space race. Because after the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite, Americans panicked, fearing they were falling behind technologically, and space became another arena of superpower competition, with enormous resources poured into demonstrating superiority. And this led to incredible achievements. Humans in space, the moon landing. But it was all driven by Cold War competition, by the need to prove your system was better, your scientists more advanced, your country stronger. And the same was true in sports, in culture, in every field. The Olympics became superpower competition by proxy. Chess matches between American and Soviet players became geopolitical events. Even ballet companies and orchestras were instruments of soft power. And both sides engaged in massive propaganda campaigns. The Americans promoting freedom and democracy and capitalism. The Soviets promoting equality and workers' rights and communism. And both sides absolutely convinced of their own righteousness, certain that they represented the future of humanity, that the other side was not just wrong, but evil. And this moral certainty made the conflict particularly dangerous, because it meant compromise was seen as betrayal, negotiation as weakness. The Cold War was fought not just between governments, but within societies. Anti-communist hysteria in America leading to McCarthyism, blacklists, loyalty oaths, people's lives ruined over suspected communist sympathies. While in the Soviet Union, any hint of Western influence was suppressed, dissidents imprisoned, artists censored, entire populations living under surveillance. And both sides pointed to the other's repression as proof of their own superiority. Americans pointing to Soviet gulags and lack of freedom, Soviets pointing to American racial segregation and economic inequality. And there was truth in both criticisms. Both systems had profound flaws, but the Cold War framework made it impossible to acknowledge this, because admitting your own side's failures seemed like giving ammunition to the enemy. And this poisoned political discourse, made nuance impossible, created a world of stark binaries. You were either with us or against us, either communist or capitalist, either freedom or tyranny. And the reality was much more complex. But the Cold War didn't allow for complexity. It demanded choosing sides. And the developing world, the newly independent nations of Africa and Asia, emerging from colonialism, were pressured to choose. Courted by both superpowers with aid and weapons and promises. And some tried to remain non-aligned, to chart a third path. But both superpowers saw neutrality as suspect, a potential opening for the other side. So there was constant intervention, constant manipulation, coups and assassinations, and support for dictators who happened to be on the right side. And this was perhaps the most morally corrosive aspect of the Cold War, the way it led both superpowers to abandon their stated principles in pursuit of strategic advantage. The Americans supporting brutal right-wing dictatorships in Latin America and Asia, as long as they were anti-communist. The Soviets supporting brutal left-wing dictatorships in Africa and Asia, as long as they were anti-capitalist. And millions of people in the developing world suffered as a result, their countries becoming battlegrounds in a conflict that had nothing to do with their interests. And nowhere was this clearer than Vietnam, where the United States committed hundreds of thousands of troops and billions of dollars and enormous destruction trying to prevent communist North Vietnam from unifying the country, and the result was catastrophic. 58,000 American dead, millions of Vietnamese casualties, a war that divided American society, discredited American foreign policy, and ultimately failed in its objective, because North Vietnam won. The country was unified under communist rule, and all the suffering had achieved nothing. And this was the tragedy of the Cold War, that so much of the conflict was over ideological abstractions rather than genuine threats, was about preventing dominoes from falling. Falling in theory rather than actual security. And the costs were borne by people who had no say in the decisions. Vietnamese peasants napalmed in their villages, Afghan villagers caught between Soviet occupiers and American armed mujahideen. Latin American activists disappeared by U.S.-backed death squads. Eastern European reformers crushed by Soviet tanks. And these weren't hypothetical costs, weren't acceptable casualties in a grand strategic game. They were real people with real lives destroyed by superpower competition. And both sides rationalized it, told themselves it was necessary, that the stakes were so high that anything was justified. But looking back, it's hard to see how many of these interventions served genuine security interests rather than ideological obsession. And the irony is that the Cold War ended not through military victory, but through the internal collapse of one of the systems. Because by the 1980s, the Soviet economy was stagnating, unable to compete with the West technologically, drained by the arms race and the war in Afghanistan. And when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and tried to reform the system through glasnost and perestroika, he unleashed forces he couldn't control. Because once people in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself were allowed to speak freely, to organize, to demand change, the whole communist edifice collapsed with stunning speed. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Communist governments across Eastern Europe were swept away in peaceful revolutions, and by 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, breaking apart into 15 independent nations. And the Cold War was over, not with the nuclear apocalypse everyone had feared, but with a whimper, with the recognition that the communist system had failed economically and politically, and the West had won without firing a shot, at least not directly, though plenty of shots had been fired in proxy wars around the world, and the end of the Cold War was greeted with enormous relief and optimism. Talk of the end of history, the final triumph of liberal democracy, peace dividends, a new world order. But what we've learned in the decades since is that the Cold War's end didn't mean the end of great power competition, didn't mean the end of ideological conflict, didn't resolve the fundamental questions about how societies should be organized, what values should prevail, how power should be distributed, and we're seeing echoes of the Cold War now, in the confrontation between the US and China, in the resurgence of Russia as a revisionist power, in the global competition between democracy and authoritarianism. And this raises the question of whether we learned the right lessons from the Cold War. Because one lesson might be that ideological competition between great powers is inevitable, and we need to manage it without letting it escalate to catastrophic war. That we need guardrails and communication and recognition of mutual interests, which is what eventually developed in latter stages of the Cold War: arms control agreements, summits, back-channel communications, all the unglamorous diplomatic work that prevented the competition from becoming annihilation. But another lesson might be that great power competition itself is the problem. That the framework of us versus them, of zero-sum thinking, of viewing every issue through the lens of strategic advantage, that this framework inevitably leads to suffering and waste and the distortion of principles. And maybe the real lesson of the Cold War is that it was largely unnecessary. That most of what happened over those 45 years didn't make Americans or Soviets more secure, didn't spread freedom or equality, benefit humanity, but instead fed military-industrial complexes on both sides, empowered hawks and hardliners, justified repression and intervention, and prevented cooperation on genuine global challenges. And this is relevant now because we face challenges that require global cooperation: climate change, pandemic disease, nuclear proliferation, challenges that can't be addressed through competition and confrontation, that require recognizing our common humanity and common interests. And yet we seem to be sliding back into Cold War thinking, into bloc politics, into viewing the world as a competition between systems. And this is dangerous, because while we avoided nuclear war during the first Cold War, we might not be so lucky in a second one, especially as more countries acquire nuclear weapons, as technology makes warfare faster and more automated, as the margin for error shrinks. And the Cold War should have taught us that this kind of confrontation, this investment of so much energy and resources into preparing for and preventing war with each other, is ultimately futile. Because real security doesn't come from military superiority or ideological victory. It comes from addressing the conditions that create instability and conflict: poverty, inequality, oppression, environmental destruction. And the Cold War prevented both superpowers from focusing on these issues, absorbed so much attention and resources that could have been used to actually improve human welfare. And both systems failed in this regard. The Soviet Union, obviously, but also the United States, which during the Cold War supported brutal dictatorships, subverted democracies, fought unnecessary wars, and created lasting damage to its credibility and to the people who suffered under the regimes it supported, and were still living with the consequences: the blowback from Cold War interventions, the instability in regions that were treated as strategic chessboards rather than places where real people lived. And this is perhaps the most important lesson: that treating foreign policy as a game, as strategic competition divorced from moral consequences, leads to catastrophe. And the Cold War demonstrated this on a global scale. 45 years of treating the world as a battlefield in an ideological struggle. And what did it accomplish? Millions dead in proxy wars, trillions spent on weapons, societies distorted by fear and paranoia. And in the end, the communist system collapsed of its own contradictions, which suggests that maybe the West didn't need to do most of what it did, didn't need to support all those dictators, fight all those wars, build all those bombs. Maybe the better approach would have been to actually live up to the values it claimed to represent. To demonstrate through example, rather than force, that democracy and freedom produced better outcomes. And there were moments during the Cold War when this happened, when American or Western achievements in science, culture, prosperity did more to undermine communism than any military action. And it was ultimately economic and political failure, not military defeat, that ended the Soviet Union. which raises the question of whether we're making the same mistakes now, whether the emerging confrontation with China is necessary, or whether it's a repeat of Cold War thinking, viewing everything through a competitive lens, seeing threats that might not exist, building up military forces and alliances that make conflict more rather than less likely. The Cold War should be to avoid this framework entirely, to recognize that competition between nations is inevitable, but doesn't have to be zero-sum, that cooperation is possible, even between very different systems, that trade and cultural exchange and dialogue can reduce tensions rather than increase them, and that the real threats we face, environmental collapse, nuclear weapons, pandemics, inequality, these require working together rather than against each other. But these lessons seem to be forgotten or ignored, or considered naive by people who think great power competition is the natural state of international relations. And maybe they're right. Maybe I'm naive to think we could move beyond Cold War thinking. But the Cold War itself shows both the dangers of this mindset and the possibility of managing it, because we did survive. We did avoid nuclear war. We did eventually reach accommodations that allowed both systems to coexist, imperfectly, tensely, but without destroying each other. And then one system collapsed on its own, which suggests that maybe the alarmists on both sides were wrong. Maybe the dominoes weren't going to fall. Maybe communist or capitalist expansion wasn't inevitable and unstoppable. Maybe most countries were going to chart their own paths based on their own circumstances, regardless of superpower preferences. And trying to control these outcomes through force and intervention was always doomed to failure. And this should inform how we think about current great power competition. Recognition that we can't control how other countries develop, can't force our system on them, shouldn't try to, and that our security depends more on our own internal strength and the appeal of our values than on military dominance or strategic superiority. And the Cold War showed this. The Soviet Union fell, not because NATO defeated it, but because it couldn't provide for its own people, couldn't innovate, couldn't adapt, and the system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, while the West succeeded not primarily because of military strength, but because it created prosperous, relatively free societies that people wanted to live in, that attracted immigrants, that generated innovation and culture. And this is the real source of power and security, not nuclear weapons or military alliances, but the ability to create societies where people can flourish. And if we focused on that, if we invested the resources currently going to military competition into addressing inequality, improving education, solving climate change, building better infrastructure, we would be far more secure than any amount of military spending can make us. Because real threats to our security come from internal decay, from failing to address our own problems, from the breakdown of social cohesion and trust. And the Cold War should have taught us this, that external enemies are far less dangerous than internal weaknesses, that the Soviet Union fell because of its own failures, not because of Western military pressure. And the United States' problems today are overwhelmingly domestic: inequality, polarization, failing infrastructure, healthcare, education. And these aren't being caused by China or Russia, but by our own choices, our own political dysfunctions. And addressing them requires focus and resources currently being diverted to military competition. And this is the final lesson of the Cold War, that it was mostly a waste, a massive expenditure of resources and attention and lives on a competition that didn't make either side more secure, that distorted both societies, that prevented cooperation on genuine challenges, and that ended not through military victory, but through the internal collapse of a system that couldn't sustain itself. And if we're smart, we'll learn from this. We'll recognize that great power competition is a trap, that it benefits only those who profit from conflict and confrontation: arms manufacturers, hawks and hardliners, politicians who use fear to maintain power. But it doesn't benefit ordinary people, doesn't make us safer, doesn't solve real problems, and we should refuse to repeat it, should insist on a different framework, one that recognizes our common humanity and common challenges, that prioritizes cooperation over competition, that judges success by human flourishing rather than strategic dominance. And this isn't naive idealism. It's pragmatic realism, because the alternative is continuing down a path that we know from the Cold War leads to waste and suffering and the constant risk of catastrophic war. And we can't afford that. We don't have 45 years to waste on another Cold War. We have urgent challenges that require global cooperation, and we need to learn from history. Need to recognize that the Cold War was a mistake, largely unnecessary, and refuse to repeat it. And that's the real lesson of the war that began the day WWII ended. That ideological competition between great powers doesn't make us safer, doesn't spread our values, doesn't benefit humanity. It just feeds the machinery of conflict and prevents us from addressing real problems. And the sooner we recognize this, the better chance we have of avoiding the mistakes of the past and building something better. But right now, we seem to be heading in the opposite direction, back toward bloc politics and zero-sum thinking and military buildup. And if we continue down this path, we'll waste another generation dealing with imagined threats while ignoring real ones, and that would be a tragedy. The dangers of this approach, and the possibility of moving beyond it. And we should honor the memory of all those who suffered during those 45 years, by refusing to repeat their suffering, by choosing cooperation over confrontation, by building a world that doesn't need another Cold War. And that's the challenge we face now, whether we'll learn from history or repeat it. And the answer will determine what kind of world we leave to the next generation.